Welcome, all of you, and for joining us this evening as the Soane Foundation brings together two eminent leaders of our design community, Mitchell Owens and Thomas Jayne, who will share their insights on Edith Wharton and the Mount. I'm Paul Whalen, chairman of the Sir John Soane's Museum Foundation, and on behalf of my fellow trustees, I'd like to thank Doug Wright, here, the chair of our Public Programs Committee, and our executive director, Bill Appleton, who helped put together this event. All of us at the foundation appreciate that you all share our passion for the Soanean world of art, architecture, and design. We've posted a picture on the screen of the beautiful breakfast room at Sir John Soane's Museum as a reminder of the reason that we're all here in support of Sir John's extraordinary masterpiece. Tonight, we are delighted that you're here to learn about Edith Wharton and her work with the architect Ogden Codman on Wharton's own house, the Mount. Mitchell Owens is the American editor of the World of Interiors and has been a design journalist since the early 1980s, as well as a lecturer on architecture and design, the history of decoration, collecting, and garden design. He has held executive positions at Architectural Digest and Elle Decor and worked as a reporter for the New York Times as contributing editor of Travel and Leisure, Departures, and other publications. He has also edited historic design books for the Acanthus Press, and his articles have been published widely, from House Beautiful to the Journal of Decorative and Propaganda Arts. I have my copy right on my coffee table. He is currently working on a biography of the 1960s style icon Pauline de Rothschild, which will be published by Rizzoli. Thomas Jayne founded the Jayne Design Studio in 1990. His academic training has greatly influenced his design philosophy. After receiving a master's degree from the Winterthur Museum's program in American Material Culture and Decorative Arts, he pursued advanced fellowships at the American wing of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Historic Deerfield, and the J. Paul Getty Museum before moving on to a position at Christie's Estates and Appraisal Department. His interest in architecture and the decorative arts eventually led him to pursue a career in interior design. He worked at Parrish Hadley and Associates and Kevin McNamara Inc. before starting his own design studio. His book, Principles for Modern Design, is a study of the decoration of houses by Edith Wharton and Ogden Codman, and the importance of that book for today. So ironically, we'll be talking about that very book this evening. Following Mitch and Thomas's discussion, I'll return to the podium to help with audience questions. And at the conclusion of the program, we'll invite you to join us for an informal reception in the adjacent room. Now, please welcome Thomas and Mitchell.
Just before Thomas and I arrived tonight at the Union Club, we were talking about Edith Wharton at the bar at Orsay. And I think our biggest insight was we would never want her working for us as a client, ever. You agree?
Yes. We decided, when I was writing about her, we decided that she was vinegary.
Vinegary, yes. Yeah, micromanaging.
She had a certain acidic acidness about her that made her interesting to read, but I don't know if you'd want to daily, try to achieve something might be harder.
No, and that's why it was very funny to hear about the association of Mrs. Wharton and Mr. Codman, because both of them were, I think you would refer to them as frenemies, despite the fact of working very closely and fruitfully together. They didn't really like one another, but they were...
But she liked him well enough to ask him to help her with her house.
True, and with the book, although he didn't carry his weight. She wrote lots of letters.
Let's talk about the book.
Okay, we'll talk about that later. Okay, so we're here to talk about the Mount and other things.
Let's just say that this is the baseline. The Decoration of Houses was written in 1897, and it was a treatise that she wrote with Ogden Codman about the decoration of houses. And it was the most important decorating book ever written, in the sense that it broke down the qualities of a house by room and then by specific parts, including fireplaces. And she also had a chapter on ballrooms, which I find very useful.
And nurseries.
And nurseries.
Nurseries.
But because she divided everything and talked about it at length, and in the classical tradition, that book still remains one of the most important pieces of literature. Now, I was working on my book and reading her book again. I decided it was like the Bible. I think people tell you they read the Bible, but they don't read the Bible because it's just so dense and hard to read that you really need a concordance with it. So that's what my book was. And to just sort of, I suggest you read it by a chapter at a time, and then think about how it applies to your life. And much of it does still apply, even though it was written in the 19th century. And some of it is just like, no, I don't think I'll have a ballroom.
No, not a ballroom. But she does talk a lot about, things that we talk about today, rooms that have multiple purposes. And
yes.
Should they actually have multiple purposes? So this is the Mount here in Lenox, Massachusetts, the house that she and her husband, Teddy Wharton, built together. They purchased the property 2 years after the publication of the Declaration of Houses.
1901, yeah.
1899, and started plans for a house. They already had a house in Newport called Land's End, which many of you may know about, on Ledge Road, much smaller than this turned out to be. And so here are our residential protagonists. On the left, Mrs. Wharton, and on the right, Teddy, Edward Wharton, a manly man who had really no taste in architecture and didn't really care about design. He liked hunting and fishing and irritating his wife, I think. But all of his friends did say, and her friends even said in his defense that early on in their marriage, he was the sort of person who brought sunshine into a room, which I thought was a very nice way to be remembered.
Yeah. I think sadly he suffered from mental affliction too, and
like his father.
Yeah, he probably was what we call bipolar now. And she was so on the ball that it must have been pretty hard for him to have a bad day, I would think.
I would think so. I mean, and they traveled widely. They looked at things, architecture, design. Even though he wasn't that terribly interested in it, he went. So he had to have learned a lot through her,
right.
And through osmosis, and enough to go along with her in 1899 on the idea of building a house that would carry on from what she'd written about in the Declaration of Houses.
Yeah.
So this is the Declaration of Houses, the first edition. The only real criticisms that I know about that it had lobbed at it at all in its infancy was the fact that she chose palatial interiors from Europe as opposed to anything more intimate. So everything's from a palace or a castle or a chateau. And you were arguing tonight, talking about that still made it valuable. It didn't need to be smaller houses.
When she was a teenager, she took her inheritance and she traveled up and down the coast of Italy. And she was in a boat, and they called on all these great Italian cities, and she had a great education in architecture and the arts. So she had amazing exposure. So she was able to refer to these great rooms casually as the Count da-da's house, and she referred to them in the text that way. And you just think, what is this house? And we would never have access to them. So they were rarefied. And the other problem is that she wanted to illustrate her book, but she didn't have photography. So her choices were limited by what was available, and she was bickering with her publisher about how many plates she would have, and then how to get them. So the more modest examples she might have included weren't photographed.
Well, there's also some very funny, tart, vinegary letters from her to Ogden Codman. One rather angry one where she points out, had I known that I was going to have to do all of the work, I wouldn't have needed a collaborator. His job was to help supply photography, and he didn't follow through. And so she was writing and then trying to get him to supply photographs to connect with what she'd written about, only he wasn't supplying them.
But he had started studying architecture as a child in Boston.
And he'd lived abroad in France as a child as well.
So he was deeply interested in architecture. He was tutored. I argue that the content of the book would be different if he had not been there, because he knew how to make a stair. He knew how to make a room. He had practical knowledge. I don't know. Who knows?
But I think that was part of, it seemed to me at least, part of the issue with them. She, like me in French, she knew enough to get into trouble and not enough to get out of it. Whereas she knew so much about architecture and was incredibly passionate about it. And like Thomas said, had this memory of all these rooms that she'd seen as a child traveling, and as did Codman. But he was a professional and didn't, I think, appreciate her in quite the same way that he could have or should have.
Sure.
Because they certainly complemented each other.
It is interesting. Well, let's see how it manifests. Oh.
So this is what she's, sorry for the pixelation, but this is what Edith was railing about in terms of the decoration of houses, were like the plutocrats of the 1880s and the 1890s who were throwing up these huge houses in Newport and taking bits and pieces from here and there and sort of cobbling them together without really any thought about the use of the room, the progress from one room to another in many ways. But this is her parents' living room on West 23rd Street, and I've always liked it myself. So, sorry. I mean, I could do without the fur carpet and things.
I think it's dubious taste.
I'm sorry. I just like it because there's lots of flowers.
Yes.
That might be my problem.
One fabric?
Yes, one fabric.
Yes.
But yeah, so she was always, she complained that, and she writes about this in The Decoration of Houses in a somewhat veiled fashion, talking about people who are inveterate shoppers. There's a chapter next to the last chapter, no, it is the last chapter in The Decoration of Houses, called Bric-a-Brac.
Oh, yeah.
And about people who can't stop shopping. And if you compare it to letters or descriptions she writes about her mother, she's basically writing about her mother, how she's unable to, she stuffs glass cabinets with fans that she's purchased on trips abroad and dubious bits of china.
But I think what she learned from this was that you needed strong architecture to make a great room, and that a decorator could work hard to efface the lack of architecture with decorations, i.e. lots of curtains and swags. But she finally said, but good interior decoration is not a branch of the haberdasher's art.
Well, no, which is very interesting, her bringing that up, because for a good portion of the 19th century, at least the audience that she was addressing in America, depended so highly on the upholsterer's art to make a room.
Her argument was because the architects weren't supplying interiors anymore. They were giving these blank rooms for people to decorate, and there was no architecture, so therefore people were overcompensating with swags and Victorian what we call excess.
And lots of fringe.
Yes.
As we can see.
But there's nothing wrong with fringe.
There's nothing wrong with fringe. I like fringe.
Some of my best friends have fringe. So let's talk about the Mount.
So we're moving on to, this is her house as a young woman at 884 Park Avenue. She and her husband, this was their city base. And so she's already at this point in her life in the 1880s is reacting very severely against what her mother was doing, and what her mother's contemporaries were doing, and what her own contemporaries were following through in terms of decoration. She's leaning very much toward the French. This is the Zuber wallpaper that lines that room. It's very clean. It's very spare. It's rational. It's logical. It's period in a way.
And it would still look good today.
It would look great today.
I mean, there's little things you change, but the whole countenance is something that we probably all would admire and like. Right.
And so here we have a corner of her drawing room at that same house, which today we were talking about it, and you said it couldn't be more Elsie de Wolfe. I mean, it's 20 years ahead of Elsie, but Elsie learned a lot from decoration of houses.
Sure did.
learned a lot. It's a very polite way of saying.
Just
She monetized the decoration of houses.
She distilled it.
She just stole it. But this is very much what Wharton was moving toward, what a lot of design was moving toward. Stanford White, some of his clients, very classical French decoration, looking very clean, very spare, very elegant, very uncluttered.
And maybe something from Italy as an exponent, like the mirror, like the.
Or we've got, is that an Asian statue on the corner cabinet? Something like that. But yes, with a few extra bits. So the first time Edith Wharton meets Codman in about 1890, they cross paths, and he becomes her renovation architect in Newport for a house called Land's End. And this is Land's End on Ledge Road, as it was at the beginning. And here are two very badly pixelated photographs. Land's End on the left, and after it had been sort of classicized to a degree by Ogden Codman, she said it was the most, I think she said it was the most unfortunate house in Newport. And Ogden Codman agreed with her in every possible way, only in stronger language, in very tart letters to his mother. She seems to have been his gossip central, always writing to his mother about everything. But they cleaned up the inside of the house. They added a porte cochere, gardens, a new entrance. It still was sort of a overgrown, rambly mongrel of a house, but it was, sort of her first feelers out into renovating a house and sort of putting what she's developing for the decoration of houses into play with someone she finds very sympathetic, this young architect from Boston. She's starting out with her classicizing of the landscape, that she would continue on at the Mount and would continue on at her gardens in France at her various properties, creating this whole tapis vert and sort of ironing out a very rocky landscape, which you can see here, all of the rocky cliffs. And then this wonderful trellis work arch that Ogden Codman had designed for the house.
Right next to the sea, though.
Right next to the sea.
I was like, why are you trying to make a formal garden on a rocky point of land, which is well known for being a rocky point of land?
Exactly, right next. And I'd love to know what people in Newport were thinking of this.
She's trying to impose French order on a Victorian house and like an informal landscape garden. So that was a fight.
Yeah, that was that fighting against the landscape, and she had more trellis work, and there are lovely letters between her and Codman of her asking him, how can the trellis work fence on this side respond to a hedge on the far side? And then she has her niece, Beatrix Farrand, come in and...
telling her she should move.
Exactly.
It's never going to be right. You need to move.
No, and this is the ledge, the Land's End as it is today, largely this, as it was in many ways, on the exterior at least, although the porte cochere is gone again. These are the interiors, which we were having a very lively discussion about it because it has nothing to do with the decoration of houses. You help me explain this because they're quite cluttered.
First of all, there's no relationship with the outside.
No.
And the interiors are interesting because they have no relationship to the outside. So this is disconnect. And also they're super upholstered. And in an era when everything has to be coastal and decoration, meaning white and seashells and blue at the beach, it's just interesting to see such a formal house at the edge of the ocean. And also it belies what she's talking about, having a sense of order and purpose to rooms. So her ideals are not represented in this Victorian house, but to her defense, the house was built, 1870, and it was out of date.
True, and she wasn't completely remodeling the whole thing to follow her tenants. She was working on it. And they were only there a few years. They didn't stay incredibly long.
No.
So in 1899, they decide to buy a property outside of Newport. She's not fond of Newport. She's not fond of the people in Newport. there's that delicious phrase where she helps Codman get work helping the Vanderbilts at the Breakers. And she tells him that how lucky he is to have this job because he will certainly be able to help them because nobody else seems to be able to help them get beyond the Thermopylae of bad taste that seems to infect that entire clan, which I do find very funny. So he was able to do the private rooms, which were very simple and much more in her taste and his taste. But she's not happy with Newport. Lenox, Massachusetts is much more to her liking. It's has an intellectual aspect to it that Newport doesn't have by any stretch. It's distant, it's picturesque, it's wooded. She has cousins there, none of whom she's fond of. And she makes that clear. She has one cousin she's fond of, but none of the rest. Teddy's mother lives up there. She has a house up there, his sister. He has other family members who live up there, so there's a much more congenial spot. She can be what some people referred to as the Lady of Lenox, because she got involved with garden clubs and got involved with entertaining and all the sorts of things that she would enjoy much more in the countryside there. So they've purchased this bit of land here on the lower left, this sort of stepped bit coming up and encompassing a bit of Laurel Lake. And you can see where the house is there. There was an existing house. But here's this lovely, charming picture from the Beinecke of Teddy at right, pointing up at Edith on the stone rocks, where they're trying to figure out how to site the house. And that rock will come in to play because it actually causes problems with the siting of the house. Their inspiration, or her inspiration, was Belton House in England. And it wasn't going to look, I guess, particularly well in the Lenox countryside.
But I mean, the takeaway is this is a 17th century house, and the portico, the pediment in the middle, and the two bays, and then the suggestion of a terrace all suited her her idea of a house, and also having the lantern. So there's some strong references, I think.
But what interests me about it is that she chooses this big house as an inspiration, and then miniaturizes it with the help of Codman and Frank Hoppen,
Right.
which I find just a really challenging thing for any architect to reduce and transform into a different landscape and even a different material, because the mount is stucco.
Yes.
Not easy in New England winters. So on the left is Ogden Codman, and on the right is Francis Hoppen of Hoppen and Cone. Codman was originally to help the Whartons with the mount, and he and Edith had one of their arguments, and it was largely about money and her micromanaging him. And so he flounced off. I think we can use the word flounce because I can see him flouncing off. And she hired Cone instead, who's a lovely architect, beautiful work, but apparently came in with a lower budget, more to her liking. So he comes in and takes over the works. And so here is his design for the west elevation of the mount. This is the entrance of the house. So the front door would be down here in the center, and up above, which would be changed when you see the house as it was built, would have been the gallery. One of the things that was sort of odd, or is sort of odd about the mount is that rock. Can we go back to that rock for a moment? They built it into the rock,
Right.
but it meant that it constricted how they could create an entrance. So when you go to the mount, you walk in, and then there's like a switchback of stairs until you get up to the main level. It's sort of odd, not hugely successful, but it is, I think, one of the things that makes the house a lot more interesting. If it were a perfect house, it would be of no interest, to me at least. I don't think to you either.
No.
Because they've had to make decisions.
So she built this house. This is her first house that she built with a clean slate. And I've noticed in my career that people get the opportunity to build a house, they want to get every idea into it that they've ever imagined. So it becomes packed with, overcrammed with too many ideas. And usually your architect or your decorator helps you sort out a few of the ideas so it's not so action-packed. And I think she was stubborn, and she didn't want to hear what her architects had to say. And she wanted to keep it jam-packed. So there's a lot of ideas at the Mount, and some came to fruition beautifully, and some were like, nice try.
Yeah, it was a nice try. And also, you had mentioned that it would be more successful if it were a smaller house.
Yes. If she made it smaller, she could have afforded to finish it. But Codman and other people were complaining that he went there and things weren't polished and the details weren't right, and it was all really about money that couldn't get finished.
Yeah, there's a very funny letter he writes again to his mother, where he talks about going to visit the house, and he talks about just how awful all the details are. Edith's not happy with Frank Hoppen, who she's let go, and she's called on Codman, who she'd already let go, to come back and help fix things. And he walks in and he tells his mother that the changes aren't that difficult. I mean, there are moldings around doors and windows and things that need to be fixed. But the floors are not polished. The wood is not sanded properly. The rooms are inexpertly painted. It's this very laughable letter to his mother about he's sort of chortling that she got her way and be careful of what you want. And now he has to come and fix it for her.
Right.
So he's having a good old time. So here's the house. About the time Codman visits it after Hoppen leaves the premises, Hoppen was complaining bitterly in multiple letters that Teddy Wharton, who was in charge of the funds of the couple, he was already experiencing mental problems and was not paying bills. They would be presented and represented and represented, and nothing would be paid. So Codman couldn't pay anybody, the contractors, the woodworkers, nobody. And so he just left. And so then Codman comes in, and this is the landscape, and this is the house he sees. And he talks to his mother and he writes to his mother saying something along the lines of, Edith doesn't have enough money to make this work, but it gets better. So there's some terracing going on, looking a little nicer. And then as we see the gardens, very Italianate gardens installed below the house, Beatrix Farrand helping, Codman helping. The trellis work arch from Land's End was moved up.
They're really successful.
They are successful.
And there's been enough information to be able to restore them. So if you go to the garden, you really do get a sense of Edith Wharton in a true way.
Yeah, I mean, it's a perfect Edwardian evocation of an Italianate garden. Yes. I mean, it's like a movie set. It's so perfect.
Yes.
It's quite astonishing how beautifully it's been restored. And I do find that one thing is very interesting, and we as a society have gotten away from, are picture postcards of rich people's houses being sold at every notepaper shop. And I love that so many of them, of the Mount, from being unfinished to finished, are constantly being printed and sold.
Well, she was very, very famous.
She was very famous.
Forget how
she got some royalties out of it.
She won the Pulitzer Prize, and she managed to write a successful book almost every year.
That's insane.
So that helped her decorating projects.
Well, and there's also a funny letter where she writes to, I think it's Codman, or she writes to one of her sisters-in-law about she needed something done at the house, so she wrote a story for Harper's, and as soon as the check arrived, she could pay for it.
Yeah.
So here you see the gardens coming down that terraced hill with the one garden, the Italianate garden at the end, and then there's a pond at the other end connected by these.
And there's a marquee they have permanently up because the Mount has to raise funds and they host weddings and parties. it's not such a presence when you're in the house, but that changes the elevation a lot.
It does change the elevation a lot, but then if you go back to, Edith had her own big summer
She did.
awning. Not quite as big as that one, but it gives you that impression. And then here are some detail shots of the two gardens at either end that are really, again, as Thomas said, they've been perfectly recreated.
And Mrs. Wharton thought that she was a better gardener than writer.
She did.
And she said, I think of myself more as a gardener than an author. So she had a higher esteem of her gardening than her books.
But I think the other thing that she has going in her favor is, even though she had editors who were looking over her work, she was her own best editor.
Yes.
And I think that her editorial eye was able to help her create gardens and interiors, but especially gardens.
Well, also, I think that helped her write The Decoration of Houses, that she was editorial, and she could sort out the what made a wall and what made a room, or whatever the chapter she was writing. I don't think she had, this is sacrilege maybe, but
Go for it.
I don't think she had personal taste in the classic way. Like she didn't have an intuition. It was very tutored.
When you read Decoration of Houses and you read her descriptions of furniture and how she feels it should be used, she doesn't do that at all in her own houses. I mean, as Codman writes, that when he comes down to look at the house, all of the furniture from Land's End is in the house. Wow. And he says it looks so incredibly sad that it's all the wrong furniture, all in the wrong house, and it shouldn't have been bought anyway.
And then the famous painter, I always like to tell the story, the famous painter Walter Gay, who did these beautiful paintings of interiors, he said that he painted them out, but he had to change all the colors because Mrs. Wharton had no color sense, which sort of tips you off that she's an author and an editor, but maybe not an aesthete.
No. Yeah. Vinegary. Maybe that kept her back from being an aesthete.
Maybe. But
here's the entrance to the mount, and as we saw in the original Hoppen and Cohn drawing, there was a long range of 5 very tall arched windows going across where the gallery is. So you have the entrance here. One of the things that Codman complained about, and that more than one person who has written about Wharton has said is absolutely true, is the forecourt, the walled forecourt. Codman complained that it looked like a place you would hang up the laundry, that it wasn't big enough, it wasn't grand enough, it didn't have enough depth, it wasn't taken seriously as a space. And it is a very awkward space. I remember thinking about that when I first went to the Mount, thinking that it didn't suit the house behind it.
She couldn't afford to dynamite the brick. There's a big rock in the front yard, and she couldn't afford to dynamite it, so that's how they adapted.
Right, and that's how you can't quite get in the entrance. You can't make a big formal entrance. You have to do this switchback of stairs that goes up to the piano nobile.
After she writes a long chapter about how important front halls are and a sense of interest.
Yeah, it does. She does. She writes this incredible, fascinating chapter about how important entrances
and the progression.
The progression of spaces, and your progression of spaces is like what somebody said something about scuttling in like a rat. You sort of go in and you go up and switch back.
She should have written an essay about how important dynamite is.
And so here's the floor plan of the main level of the house, and you see you have this main stair hall, but you have to come up this staircase that's rather shallow, as I recall, and then you come into the gallery, which is the main spine of the house, off of which the rest of the rooms open. Not always happily, but that's the navigational space.
And evidence of her struggle is, she writes in The Decoration of Houses how important it is to build your stairs out of stone, and that this is the most important aspect of a house. And of course, the stairs at the Mount are wood. And it's just those sort of compromises that reality made her make.
Yeah, we all make them. I mean, and that's what makes the Mount really
you don't
interesting.
Have stone stairs? You don't have stone stairs?
We don't have stone stairs. No.
God,
They have creaky
we got to
woodworks.
help you.
I know, it's sad. But I do think this is interesting. Is like it's as Thomas was saying, it's her first ground up, actually her last ground up house, her first and her last
Yeah.
ground up production. And she makes mistakes, and she cuts corners, and she argues with her architects, and she thinks she knows more than the expert does. And then she has to call in the previous expert to fix it. And it's a good story. It's like a house that never stops having stories. I think you could write book after book after book about this house,
Sure.
and they would all be different,
Yeah.
because you'd have these endless journeys and paths of how you want to handle it. One thing that I think is really interesting about the house is, Thomas, when was it decorated as sort of a showcase?
Just
house?
right when it reopened, I guess in the 90s.
90s?
Yeah. But, okay,
Were
before
you-
we go that far.
Okay, no, but we were just showing these two spaces. So this is the gallery as it was when the Whartons lived there, and this is as it is today, from the
Yes.
opposite direction.
So Mrs. Wharton was happy in this house. She said that it was one of her happiest times in her life. So we have to realize that she was pleased with her pudding, and we are picking it apart in hindsight.
No, but she was happy.
Yes.
And I think that's, but I mean, even she knew that there were issues with it, but it didn't matter.
Yeah.
She was happy.
She was happy. And I think partly because she had an independent social life, and it allowed her to meet people, and that made her happy.
It did. She was able to meet a lot of intellectual people in the area, writers, artists, people of note who she could be part of that firmament.
Yes.
It was a different society than it was in New York or in Newport. She was happier there. Her love affair with the American journalist Morton Fullerton started here at one point.
A younger man.
Younger man.
Yes.
If you haven't read the book Mysteries of Paris about Morton Fullerton, you must order it on Amazon this evening. He's quite a character. But she was very, very happy in this house. And it is a happy house.
Sure.
I mean, it has wonderful sunlight. The scale of the rooms is nice. I wouldn't turn it down.
So after you get through the low front door and you climb up the stairs, you're presented with, this is your reward for going through the labyrinth to her house. This beautiful entrance hall that I think is many people's favorite room. It holds up on an international level, I think. It's so handsome. And you can see that when we had the show house, it was painted in a contemporary way. And it was blue, it was green with pink trim as opposed to the reverse that you see there. And you can see she had all sorts of interesting things in the hall, jars and artifacts. So you really got a sense of welcome once you got through the past the rock, under the small door, up the wooden staircase, and then you got this, which was a pretty good thing.
Well, then as every good entrance hall should, it gives you a hint of the rooms to come.
Yes.
I mean, it's a mixture of many things, some good, some not so good, but all very representative of the inhabitants.
Yes.
I think it would be wonderful to put similar things back, because she didn't have museum quality objects as a whole.
Right.
She had a lot of things that many people of her station had at that time period.
Yes.
And they would be, I think, relatively, I do use the term relatively easy to conjure up a simulacrum of what it could be like if it were to be more of a house museum.
Yes. Well, we have a few photographs. This was one of them. There's only 4 or 5 pictures of the interiors of the mount.
I know, it's
So
insane.
there'd be a lot of guessing about other sides of the room that weren't photographed. So it's hard.
No, it is hard. And of a woman of her stature, the architects, she was involved with the ambition of the house. It didn't appear in Architectural Record or Architectural Review or any of those magazines.
Sure.
To be able to examine much more closely
Yes.
what her interiors were really like.
Yeah. Mm.
So here's her famous library that Codman came in and fixed. He added these rather exuberant Grinling Gibbons-ish moldings over the bookcases and such, which again go in contravention of what Mrs. Wharton said a library should have. But it works, and it's a wonderful room. And it famously has her actual books in it, which is a rather extraordinary thing that they were brought back to the house.
Yes.
But again, as you can see, it's a much more crowded room. It's very cozy, 2 writing desks, multiple lamps, multiple places to sit,
It's
crowded and interesting.
It's crowded though, but compared to her parents' house, or this is what, 1905, 1910?
Right.
Well, first of all, the houses of that stature were piled full of things.
Right.
It was typical. But then at the same time, I find it really fascinating what's going on in the rest of the country. You have Frank Lloyd Wright, you have the Craftsman movement, you have colonial revival, and then you have this European-leaning interior. So there's many camps of interior design at that point. And I think that's pretty fascinating when you think that she just went for this all-European aesthetic.
Well, she was happier in Europe
Yes.
in general. She was
Yes.
happier in France.
Well, there was also that the upper class always thought French was better. So you had what we called Park Avenue French, where
Right.
where Americans take on what a French room is. The Reitzman rooms are a good example of Park Avenue French.
That's very true.
Yeah, American take on French rooms and their contents. And I think that Edith Wharton could be considered a progenitor of that in the sense that she was so much a Francophile. And
Well, those rooms on Park Avenue, her 884
yes,
rooms, would look perfectly fine today,
yes,
as you'd said.
and slightly Parisian.
Slightly Parisian.
Yeah.
And on the left is a period photograph of the drawing room, and on the right is the drawing room as created by Charlotte Moss, based on that photograph. And it's still part of the house today.
Yes.
But again, she's you can see how interesting it is that she's really been able to represent what went on in 1905 in this room, but in a more contemporized way without being contemporary.
I think it's successful.
And then this is Mr. Jaynes's.
That's less successful.
Not true. I love this room. This is Teddy Wharton's study, which is on the floor plan across the hall from Edith's library. How did you go about creating this room, which did not have any photographs
Yes.
of it, and you knew who the man was and his interests and the life of the house at that time?
So Teddy was in charge of the estates and the accounting. He liked wine. He was interested in scandal. And Mrs. Wharton decorated his room for him. And she argued that men's rooms should be hard-wearing and like clubs. That you needed to have upholstered chairs, and it needed to be rough and tumble because you don't want men to leave the house and go to their clubs. So you have to do that at home. And I think she would have recliners and a remote control and a big TV if it was necessary.
Probably.
And so our charge was to refurnish the room in a contemporary way that looked in the Anglo-Franco tradition. Bring it up to date, if you will. If Mrs. Wharton were alive today, what would she have in her room? And this is what we invented. And one thing that was interesting is we picked out all the paint colors, and then we looked at the paint analysis, and I had picked out the same colors as the paint analysis. So there's this sort of shorthand for this turn of the century decoration. That
Right.
It was good. And you can't see it all, but they're really big, comfortable sofas and French chairs and a contemporary architect's table that was used as a desk.
So they lived in this house for about 10 years. Their marriage fell apart and had already been falling apart for quite some time. She decamped. They rented it out for a while. Then she decamped to France. She made a deal with Teddy that she would give him an allowance. He could still manage the estate, but he could not sell the house during her absence, which is precisely what he did. She got a telegram that he'd sold the house. And her friend Walter Van Rensselaer Barry, who she'd been in love with the year before she married Teddy Wharton, And she turned down his engagement, I think, to her regret, because he remained her best friend forever. He said that she got out of it lucky. She got rid of him and the house in one fell swoop. But we were also talking about what she was spending on the house, the architects that she was working with. And we realized that what she could have had if she'd had the money, had maybe scaled back the Mount a bit and had stuck with Codman despite their arguments.
Yes.
And this is Ogden Codman's own house on 96th Street, completed in 1913. Codman had married a very rich widow who didn't last very long. And she happened to leave him all of her money. And he also had control of her children's money, which didn't turn out well. But he built this incredibly pretty house on 96th Street. It was the very first house on the north side of the entire stretch of 96th Street from Fifth Avenue all the way over. And all it had were tenements behind and no neighbors on either side. But it was this very pretty French hotel particulier. It was a C shape. It sort of went back, and then you see the bow for the dining room, and then the little back of the house this way. And so this is what she didn't get at the Mount, but what Codman lived with. She was already in France at that time, and he was already threatening to leave America for France, and eventually did. And here are some other interiors, much more rarefied, much simpler, much more decoration of houses.
And resolved.
Resolved.
Yeah.
But in a way, the Codman house is perfect. It is absolutely perfect.
Do you think it lacked of invention? Or
Yes.
It's very literal, whereas the Mount is more inventive.
I don't think he got, there were moments obviously where he was inventive. Certainly at La Leopolda, he was very inventive in a super grand way. But no, he's not inventive here. This is very much, if you open the front door, this is what you could walk into in Bordeaux. It's what you could walk into in Paris, yes, in the 7th. It's a very literal French house.
So that's an interesting thing about the Mount is she picked an English model for the outside, but then the rooms all have international character. More like an Edwardian house where you had a French room and an English room. And
right.
Yeah, and he's pure. It's all French.
And that's why at the beginning, when Thomas and I were talking about putting this conversation together, I love that Henry James quote when he visits the Mount for the first time and describes it as a delicate French chateau mirrored in a Massachusetts lake. And I remember looking at it and thinking, it's not delicate, it's not French, and it's not a chateau. But and it was a Massachusetts pond. I'm like, and it's a lake, and it's not reflected in it at all. I mean, you've done this lovely dramatization of what it could be, but it's not what it was. And I always wondered what she thought when she read that letter, her delicate French chateau.
Well, I think she thought of it as not as an exacting thing, but as a suggestion.
As a romantic thing.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, all of his
Can you
compliments.
imagine having Henry James as a house guest, though? That would be totally horrible.
No. Henry James would be awful as a house
I might have
guest.
meet him for dinner in the city.
He
was in her house.
No. There's a lovely, he sends her a fan letter in 1900, I think. She's written a story, I believe it's called Summer, and it appeared in a magazine. And he writes this fan letter, and you think, this is not the person you'd want to have at your house for a weekend.
Yes.
He writes her a letter, and for every compliment, he backhands her.
Sure.
He talks about how ambitious the story is, how elegant her language is, but you don't give the husband enough to do in the plot. And it's this constant going back and forth. And I'm reading this letter going, and she liked this letter. This is, she's already 38 years old and a published writer and, on her way to a Pulitzer.
But I think that the criticism of the Mount is like that, where there's a plus category and then there's
negative category.
What's happening here?
But it's still a wonderful house.
But we really don't know why some things happen. So, except I mean, we do know about the rock in the front yard,
We do know about the rock.
but
And she built her husband a very pretty stable
yeah. Oh, that's
based
beautiful.
on Belton's,
Yes.
which he loved, apparently.
But the drawing room was pretty uninspired, but from what we know.
True. Probably not many were that exciting. I mean, also you're talking about the same time period, 20 years after you've had the artistic houses of New York with all those incredibly
Yes.
interesting houses that Tiffany and Herder and everybody were decorating that were hugely adventuresome.
What if Herder Brothers had decorated Edith Wharton's house?
I don't think she would have let them in the front door.
No, but it's too much like her parents. Herder Brothers was a great manufacturing. They decorated houses. They famously they decorated the Vanderbilt house, and they were pioneers of the aesthetic movement, I would say. And they were German, and they made incredibly beautiful and high-style furniture.
Well, and also incredibly odd furniture, the stuff at the Met that's ended up there.
Yes.
That wonderful stuff for William Vanderbilt's office,
Yes.
which is quite astonishing.
Yes. But so that's probably everything she didn't want. But
No, and then she goes to France and she buys 2 or 3 over time, really beautiful period French chateau, little chateau,
Yes.
and buys an old monastery in the south of France, right next door to Marie-Laure and Charles de Noailles. Talk about 2 less dissimilar neighbors. And the only thing of hers that survives is the mount.
And I feel
That
sorry.
was hers.
I feel sorry for her because in 1897, in the Decoration of Houses, she's writing about how exciting she is, that people are picking these beautiful models, and the age of classicism has been revived. And she pointed to the Chicago Exposition and the New York Public Library and the Boston Public Library as these examples where people are picking good models and making beautiful houses, and life is good. And by the time she dies, she's having to deal with modern. And that must have been really wrenching for her. Maybe she was just in her chateau with the door locked, but it must have been really awkward or hard for her to see a triumph and then see it erode within a few decades.
Well, that's what I'm always thinking of her being able to see from her house in Yare to the Malley Stevens villa, that great ocean liner of a house done for the Noailles,
Yes.
all full of Jean-Michel Franck furniture and Joe Bourgeois pieces. And she must have just gone back home and taken an aspirin.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have been her thing.
I so wish she'd written about it because it would have been so insightful.
That would have been interesting.
Yeah.
Have we any questions? Most of them for him, as opposed to me.
How long did it take to build a house?
It was.
A year.
Yeah.
It was a year.
It's just made out of wood and stucco. It's like I always say it's like a stage set. You know, it's all sort of smoke and mirrors to a certain degree.
Which was sort of astonishing to me, a
its
year.
Surface area is very plain, out of a catalog, what you got in 1900, stock stuff.
Yeah, the nickel sinks, the china cabinets, it's
Could
all,
have been any big city, anywhere, really.
it could have been in a hotel.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, do we know anything about her apartment in Paris and how it was furnished?
On the
There's-
Rue de Varennes.
Yeah.
She had that pretty apartment, and she was very unpleasant about the people she rented it from, so I won't go there. But it was pretty. She had French antiques and modern things, I mean, contemporary reproductions and things. I don't think I've seen a photograph of it. I've just seen it described. And she had that for quite a while.
Yes. We don't have very good photographs of any of
Which
it.
is odd because this house for 10 years, and I think we've got 5 photographs.
Yeah.
And they're all corners of rooms.
And do you think that's because she didn't help? Why did she not photograph it? Do you think she wanted privacy, or was she literal and not visual? That just always amazes me.
That I don't know.
Yeah.
Who took the photograph of her that you showed in the beginning?
Do you know
Oh, I don't know who took that photograph of her as a younger woman.
That period, you know, I don't know
Yeah.
something about it.
it does have that ethos. Yeah.
Sergeant or something.
Yes. Yeah. It's a handsome. She was not pretty, but she looks handsome in that photograph. By her own admission, she was not pretty. I'm not judging her for that. But
Did she really write in bed all the time?
well, when I was there, she. Yes, I think that's
Yeah, the story was she wrote in bed and dropped the pages on the floor,
That's true.
and her secretary had to figure out what page went with what,
She,
which goes with that vinegary aspect, I think.
yeah. She,
Yes?
Between the historic photos you have and the present day, how much of the furniture is existing that was original?
poof, all gone.
All gone.
Well, her husband sold it off while she was away. While you were away, I sold the house and all the contents at a country auction. True, this is true. And the thing is, I think this stuff was so undistinguished that it just fell into the used furniture market. It wasn't like it was really period, there was nothing about it to distinguish it from the general
There are
stuff.
probably pieces still kicking around in Lenox,
I mean, there should
an
be.
attic or a barn or something.
But I don't think it was sold as the property of Edith Wharton. I think it was just sold at Joe's auction house.
Right.
So it's been very hard. There are very good photographs of her bedroom and her boudoir, and they've made an effort to refurnish that to match the photographs. And seriously, the people who restored it went to the Paris flea market and bought reproduction French furniture. And it's
Right.
it's correct.
It is correct.
Looks good.
And her boudoir, not only did she move the furniture from Land's End, she moved the curtains from all the rooms into Land's End, into the Mount, and had them sort of reconfigured for the private rooms,
Yes.
like her toile de joie.
Yes, sir.
So she had great connections with great writers of the day, but did she have connections with any visual artists, Sargent, White, St. Gaudens?
I mean, we know she knew Walter Gay, but there doesn't manifest itself much.
No, she doesn't seem to circulate in those sorts of circles.
She's in a literary world, and I think that the Mount today focuses on writing and literature and authors rather than the aesthetics of the Mount. So the inside is, well, I think it's disappointing because there's no one there that really wants to present it as a house. It's more used for rooms, for parties and presentations.
Fundraisers and things like
So
that.
they really can't really be fitted out in a domestic way. It is used for, it's a social, it's like, I don't want to say this word, but it's like a catering hall. And that keeps the Mount alive and it makes it successful. And I think if it was restored to a house museum, it might not be the best thing.
I have to say that thinking about what Edith Wharton would say if she knew her house had become a catering hall is really terrifying.
It's not, I don't mean it that way though.
No, I know, but we know what you mean. It's not.
It's a heavy
It's
use
not a house. It's a heavy use house.
for parties.
It is interesting to find out, though, that nobody there is that interested in the aesthetics of it, which is too bad. It sort of seems like just even in the entrance hall, it'd be nice to get back to something closer to what she had there originally.
Yes. It's a hard.
It was struggling to survive for a while.
Oh, very long time. So I'm glad it's still breathing.
It's
and it's
they're-
very active.
And they're successful and they're in the black. And thank you.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's extraordinary that, it may not be a house museum, but to know that library has her actual books in it,
That's cool.
and her father's books, is pretty extraordinary to me. That adds an enormous
Sorry,
degree
I
of
just want to interrupt.
atmosphere.
Sorry. I want to make sure we have time to have drinks together. And you can still ask questions inside. We'll continue the conversation right next door. Thank you, Mitch and Thomas, that was really wonderful. Now, some of you may not know this, but John Soane himself had a country house, and he also lost his country house because he couldn't afford it. And the name of that house is Pitt's Hanger, and it is now a house museum that you can go see. Put it on your list for the next time you're in London. It's very interesting. And I'm pleased to announce that our next program at the Soane Foundation will be a talk by Claire Gow, the director of Pitt's Hanger Manor, and Matthew Morgan, the director of the J.M.W. Turner's House Museum. The talk will focus on the friendship between Sir John Soane and J.M.W. Turner, the most famous and innovative painter of his time. Interesting that we were talking about architects and designers and painters. Soane actually had this really close relationship to the painters of his day, including the most famous one, J.M.W. Turner. I love that they were actually fishing buddies. So the details of that talk will be available soon. So keep an eye on our website and on our Instagram to learn more about that and our other events coming up this spring.
When do you plan that?
I would tell you immediately if I knew. So keep an eye on our Instagram, as I will. And I'm not sure if we have any sense of when it will come.
It's going to be early May.
Okay, that's an idea. It's a neighborhood. Okay, wonderful. Please join us for drinks next door. And thank you all for coming.